A scenario is the first step to modeling a use case. Let's see where scenarios come from and why we use them. Remember this use case? A user wants to make an espresso. He's the only actor, and there are a few preconditions. We need to have the boiler at the right temperature, enough water and beans. And then we go through the process of making the espresso. There are a couple of exceptions that might happen. And then at the end, we realize or see exactly what the state of the machine is. So a scenario represents one run of this use case. It doesn't show the logic of what might happen. It just explains what happens in one particular execution of your system. So they describe a sequence of events of a use case, and they do it in prose. There's no special syntax. It's a bullet list of events that happen. But it's important that it lists events that occur and doesn't describe the states of the system. So here we have our use case again. And I want to note that you have to have at least one scenario for each exception, plus one for the ideal run. So in this case, we have one scenario for the ideal use case, and then we need two more. The second scenario would be for the exception where the user changes the amount of coffee during operation, and the third scenario would be that the user changes the amount of grind during the operation. We might end up needing more scenarios depending on when these exceptions may occur during the process. So I want to sketch the ideal scenario here. The first part of it is that the user presses the coffee button. So this is the very first event that occurs. Then grinding begins, grinding completes, compressing begins and then completes, dispensing begins and then completes, disposal begins and then completes, and then finally the machine displays its state. So in this ideal scenario, I want you to note that we only describe events. So grinding begins and grinding completes are two different events. That is, it takes time for the machine to grind the beans. So we can't have an ideal scenario have an event called grinding, because grinding is a state. Grinding, compressing, dispensing, and disposal are, at a high level, the states that we see for the system. But we want to describe only the events as part of this scenario. Let's see where these events came from in the description. So our very beginning of the description tells the event that kicks all of this off, the user pressing the coffee button. Then we see that quite a few events come from the machine grinding the beans and dispensing the coffee. And then we have a final postcondition event that occurs, which is that the machine indicates the state. It's important to see that in this scenario, the exceptions are not included. So these two exceptions are not mapped to part of the ideal scenario. Scenarios are revised when we actually see those exceptions show up, and that makes us have different runs, so different scenarios. So I've duplicated the ideal run here, and I want to remind you of what the exceptions could be. The user could change the amount of coffee during operation, so this is the amount of water that the user wants to be dispensed. And so one of these, the user adjusts the amount of liquid that comes out. I'm going to describe this exception, and I'm going to, as a shorthand, use a star here. So in this particular scenario, this event, the user adjusting the coffee quantity, could occur in lots of different places. So it could happen right after the user presses the coffee button, but before grinding begins. It could happen during grinding, after grinding, but before compression begins. Clearly, you could see that this event could occur anywhere in between all of these other events. And the number of permutations here would be large. So one downside of using a scenario is that you can get carried away by describing in prose all of the different permutations that you might see, and that actually may drive you a little bonkers. So this is why scenarios eventually give way to sequence diagrams to help manage this kind of complexity. So with a sequence diagram, we'll see how we can take this system that may have many different events that are occurring and decompose it in such a way that we can manage this complexity. So the scenarios help us kick off this process of building sequence models. And we build sequence models after we've designed our use cases or thought about our use cases. So they enable a quick understanding of which areas of our design may need additional effort, or whether we need to go back to the drawing board and redesign our use cases because it looks like our scenarios are going to be too complicated. Scenarios should also be utilized just long enough to be sure that you're ready for the design. So don't spend too much time on them. Use them to make sure that you're thinking about your events like events, and that you're thinking about your states like states. And as a note, scenarios are frequently skipped by experts or in small and simple designs. Once you get really good at making scenarios, some designers can jump straight to designing their sequence models and drawing sequence diagrams just as soon as they've thought about their use cases.